So here are the answers to the questions that I put in the module. So first one was, can you explain the difference between a statute and a regulation? And the difference between statute and a regulation is this. A statute is made by a legislative body, and a regulation is made by an administrative or regulatory agency. So Congress or the state legislature would make a statute, and an agency like the EPA or the FTC or the Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs would promulgate a regulation. The second question was, does funeral service law include both statutes and regulations? And the answer to that is yes. There are many statutes as well as many regulations that affect funeral service. So at the state level, typically laws that concern who has the right of final disposition, who can practice funeral service or mortuary science, those things are typically going to be in statute. And then regulations are going to be things like requirements for your funeral home, requirements for the prep room, crematory regulations, cemetery regulations, things like that. So funeral service laws exist both in statutes and in regulations. So moving on to the second video. We have an example where a funeral home is sued by a family for negligent embalming. Is that a civil case or a criminal case? That's a civil case. So it's actually a sub-area of civil law called negligence, which is part of torts, which we'll talk about in another lecture. But it doesn't have anything to do with a criminal case. Now, some things that a funeral director does could be a crime, and you can have the same act that's a crime and a tort, but if you're just talking about a lawsuit for negligent embalming, most likely it's a negligence case, which would be civil law. And the question about whether it's state court or federal court, well, it depends. Most of the time it's going to be state court. The only time that it would be federal court is if you had the plaintiff and the defendant as citizens of different states. That doesn't typically occur. It could, but in most cases it's going to be a civil case in state court.